Take note of Gary Lucas. He is a guitarist who is best known for playing with Captain Beefheart in the 1980s and Jeff Buckley in the 1990s. He has collaborated with everyone from Leonard Bernstein to John Zorn. He has done extensive work in music publicity, which, although it doesn't quite seem simpatico with all the other stuff that I mentioned, it really works out, and you'll learn how. His contribution to that field features one of my favorite bands ever. This is the Music Is My Life podcast, presented by Berklee Online. I'm your host, Pat Healy, and on this edition, Gary Lucas takes us right up to the present from his humble beginnings, listening to his parents' Broadway soundtrack and film soundtrack albums. But as always, we'll let him tell you about that.
I'm thinking My Fair Lady for the Broadway soundtracks and Dr. Zhivago for a film soundtrack. And these things really made an impression on me. And I loved listening to music. I mean, it warmed my soul, I'd say, to just be bathed in this. I then discovered Top 40 radio of my hometown of Syracuse, New York. And I would spend hours just out of nursery school before I went to kindergarten even, listening to whatever they would play in the afternoons in a rocking chair. I'd just rock back and forth and listen to the local DJs. This is late 50s into the early 60s. My father, out of the blue, came to me in 1961 and said, "How would you like to play a musical instrument? How about the guitar?" Up to that point, I'd never even considered such a thing. And I was like, "Gee, Dad, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Why not?"
Uh-huh.
Simultaneously, the band leader in my elementary school band, he also led the band for the junior high and the high school in Syracuse that I was geared up to be going to. These are public schools. He administered a music aptitude test to, I think, my 5th or 6th grade class. And I scored 100, or a perfect score. It was to test your musical aptitude and abilities vis-a-vis pitch and rhythm recognition and stuff like that. So based on my high-performing score on this test, he assigned me the French horn to begin studies, which, if you know your band instruments, it may be the most difficult, certainly the most difficult brass instrument in the arsenal of instruments. But of all instruments, I'd say, short of the violin, it is certainly the most difficult pitch-wise to achieve a good intonation on that instrument. And actually, he didn't pay much attention to my physical aptitude to realize, anything significant on this instrument, because if you look at a picture of me, you'll see I have a very thin upper lip. So I wasn't really born with a good embouchure, or let's say the physiognomy to be able to produce a good embouchure on this instrument. Nevertheless, I soldiered on and took simultaneously to my guitar lessons. Within about a week, I was studying the French horn as well. So I had this parallel track in music going on at 9 years old. The band leader threw me out of the band some years later for wearing sandals to the band room. Yep.
God forbid.
He also, this is a true story, I finally got the heave-ho out of the band because he caught me improvising on a march. And so, I thought I was making it better. I thought I was jazzing it up, as they say. I was inspired to try and improvise a bit like Dixieland, but no, you couldn't.
Did you find different people to play with after you got booted out of the band?
Well, I think that was the end of my French horn career, because at that point I realized I'm never going to have a great embouchure. It's really hard to produce a beautiful mellifluous tone. And I had some virtuosos. I was like the second chair. I had a girl next to me, Nancy Flynn, who could really play that French horn. So I sort of gave it up at that point, although I resurrected the French horn on the first album I ever played on, which was Captain Beefheart's doc at the radar station in 1980. When I told him that I played the French horn, he said, "Oh, you got to play some of that on this album, man."
That's great.
Yeah. So I have a short excerpt on a song called "The Best Batch Yet," or just "Best Batch Yet" on side 2. Yeah.
I want to obviously ask you about Beefheart a little bit, but I want to go first, like just go along the progression a little bit of your life, and with getting kicked out of the band, did you start playing pickup in any bands with guitar with anybody? Or were you on your own?
I right away was in and out and tried to start several bands, and I was at that point we called them the Combo. They weren't really, the word band was not in common musical parlance in Syracuse at that point. So it was still the era of the Combo. Yeah. We played at some school assemblies in the 6th grade. And at that point, I borrowed from my guitar teacher a very, very basic, primitive electric guitar that he owned to be able to be amplified. And I used my parents' large FM radio to plug into the speaker jack in order to do this. I don't know if kids know this, but in the old days, in lieu of having a standalone amplifier, you could use a good-sized FM radio to be able to play through. So,
yeah, I started that way.
You did? Okay, so you know. So
yeah,
that was probably my first public performance. Playing guitar to the school assembly, and yeah, we got cheered, and I think the repertoire consisted of A Swingin' Safari by Bert Kempfert, who was a German big band leader who had several pop hits, and we did the theme from Peter Gunn, which I always loved, by Henry Mancini, one of my favorite pieces. Also Donald Fagen's, apparently I read a book written about his formative influences. It was you couldn't miss bluesy.
Learning guitar in the 80s, that was one of the first songs I learned. With just that the one string, and you just climb up. Oh
yeah. I didn't venture forth into writing until much later, and that would be about 1988. And really, I had some great professional gigs. Like I played with the Yale Symphony Orchestra lead guitar in Leonard Bernstein's Mass for the European premiere of his Mass. That was in 1973. I was already a junior at Yale. In my junior year, I did this. That was a big thrill. Right. That was my first performance in Europe, and Lenny himself gave me a huge compliment. My hero. If you had to say who is my big hero in music, at that point, I would have said Leonard Bernstein, because I grew up on his young people's concerts on CBS and learned a hell of a lot about music from shows about Mahler. He introduced the world, really, to Mahler en masse. And Charles Ives, The Unanswered Question. He was great. He was the single most influential and engaging personality to turn many, many people onto music as a pursuit and a love. And his books were great, The Joy of Music, for instance.
So how did you get that gig?
How I got that gig was I was just walking on the regular campus of Yale, and I saw a sign that said, singers, dancers, players, electric guitarists wanted to audition for European premiere of Leonard Bernstein's Mass with the Yale Symphony Orchestra. Please contact John Mussari, who was the conductor of the Yale Symphony at that point. And so I saw that and I said, electric guitar, I want to do that. Let me go out for that. So I contacted him and he gave me some music. And then actually the first note that is audible of this piece is a shimmering electric guitar chord, arpeggiated. A beautiful major key suspended chord, which I probably will someday recall how to play. But it opened the piece. It was in the clear. I don't know. It's not on the tips of my fingers, but
Yeah.
and I did that, and I was like, I can figure this out. I can still sight read. I'm not a great sight reader, but because of my days in the school band with the French horn and the orchestras, I was able to study up on that score to be able to play it and sight read it with it. And that's how I got to Europe with them. And it was televised, they filmed it for PBS. It was shown in America and it was shown in Europe. I found a copy in the archives of the Austrian National TV, ORF, and recuperated it, as they say, and have some copies I gave to my friend. I was just writing a woman who was my friend, who was one of the singers and dancers in the production. She's now the head of undergraduate film studies at Columbia, Annette Insdorf, wow. Dr. Annette Insdorf. But she was hoofing it up and singing in this Yale production. Right. So it was a great experience, and it's a great piece. And for whatever reason, I don't know exactly why, there's been a check that's inhibited a proper release of a DVD of that show.
Oh, weird.
Yeah. Huh. I don't know whose copyright's being infringed or what. Maybe it's the wishes of the estate. I don't know.
And you said...
But it's never come out, and everything else Lenny was involved in pretty much came out on DVD.
Right. And you said he paid you a great compliment, but I don't think you mentioned what it was.
Yeah, well, this is what he said. At the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador had a party for the participants and Lenny, who came to supervise the production, or he came to make some comments to Massari in the rehearsals and, put his input on the show. And so he received us in the garden of the ambassador from the United States. And so I introduced myself to him, and he looked me over, and I was in those days in full glam rock regalia, with like crushed velvet pants and platform shoes, and my hair was like Mark Bolan's. And so he looked at me, and he looked me up and down, and he went, "Oh, the David Bowie look." That was what the first remark. So I said, "Yeah, I like him." And then he said, "So what did you do?" I said, "Well, I was playing lead guitar, and I really liked this piece where you let me improvise, or the score calls for like wild blues improvisation." And he went, "Man, I heard that. You were really wailing." Now that remark made my year, made a large chunk of my life. I thought, man, to get a compliment from Lenny on my playing, first of all, it's unusual because most of the musicians he might compliment, they're not allowed to improvise. I was lucky enough to get a passage I could soar over, and do my, blues rock thing. So that's how I met him, and then how that led to Beefheart. Well, it didn't directly, but it gave me a taste. It gave me a taste of performing and being on a stage, on a big stage. And I liked it, even though I was in this, it wasn't a pit orchestra. I was off in the wings. They had a lot of the orchestra on stage, but the main action was the center of the stage with these singers and dancers, little play tableau being acted out. It's a great piece. It's a theater piece for like four. Yeah. So, I just remember being inspired and wanting to do it more. So I got an Epiphone cornet before I left for Yale, and this became my workhorse guitar. It was like a sort of a mini Stratocaster with one pickup, like a PE90 type of a pickup. And, this was sufficient. I went as a freshman down to downtown New Haven and bought a real cheap-ass guitar amplifier for about $40. A little tube amp, tiny. But I could get a great distorted tone out of this thing. And so there I'd sit in my dorm room wailing along with records with this great distorted guitar sound. And just, continued to progress.
Right.
Didn't do that much playing out, but was seeing a lot of concerts, loving, seeing things like John McLaughlin, when the Mahavishnu Orchestra and Miles Davis came up to Yale and played. And then I went down and saw Beefheart's first show. That was what really changed my life. Discovered the music. I bought Trout Mask in high school. And because it said produced by Frank Zappa on the back. I'd seen the Mothers. I was a big fan. And then I really, after seeing him live, I said, if I ever do anything in music, I'm going to play with this guy. I told my friends. I went down there with 2 friends, and it's ironic because these same friends, Steve Handel and Bob Rubin, are involved, in the release of the record I do with Nona Hendrix, The World of Captain Beefheart.
Isn't that kind of how you ended up playing with Beefheart? You just went up and introduced yourself or something, right?
Yeah, basically that was it. I mean, it was a little bit more circuitous. What happened is that concert blew my mind to the degree I was telling my friends, I'm going to play with this guy. I've sort of made a vow, and I'm a very strong-willed person often when I get obsessed by stuff. And I went back up to Yale, where I was also the music director at WYBC, Yale's radio station. I said, this is the greatest concert I've ever seen in my life, and this band is it. And so I was known up there as his biggest fan and proselytizer, right? So 6 months later, he came back up to the East Coast on a tour that Warner Brothers Records put him on. And they contacted YBC and said, he's actually going to play up here at Woolsey Hall in New Haven. Do you have someone who can interview him? So I got the gig, just by default, because I was the Beefheart go-to guy in Yale at that point. And I have a tape in my collection somewhere in the basement of me on the receiving end of a phone call from him. Yeah. He was based in Boston. Well, he was really nice, but I was a little scared. You could hear it in my voice. I'm trembling a little bit, like, oh my God, my idol is about to call. And I was still a fanboy a bit, and he was supposed to have ESP and magical powers. And he did evince a little bit of this over the years to me too, also, which is another story. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say magical and supernatural, but he had a gifted, intuitive, and let's say he was certainly in sync in a synchronistic way with a lot of things other people missed going on. I just think really all of the things that people say are extra paranormal, I'm sure there are scientific explanations for them, but some people are more sensitive than others.
Yeah, I guess
to pick up
give
stuff.
Give me an example of something you witnessed that would,
Well, he was able. The night John Lennon was shot, he was doing an interview in my apartment, and during this interview, there was some kind of disturbance psychically. Did I hear anything? I might have heard a car backfire. Did I hear a gun going off up at the Dakota? I'm not sure. But he stopped the interview and said, listen, man, something really heavy just went down, and you're going to read about it on the front page of the paper tomorrow morning. Now, you skeptics out there could say, well, that's just coincidence. But what are the odds, right? It would seem fairly certain and portentous, and then in lieu of what happened later, it seemed like he was tuned into something, probably that event. And what happened is we just sort of ignored it, and then, go back to the interview. And then the second interviewer came, the first guy left, and an hour or so later, the first guy called up and said, Gary, man, did you hear John Lennon was just shot? And I'm playing the tape back of Don. And then, I asked him about it, and he just looked and said, like, didn't I tell you? Yeah. So he was not fazed by it. Yeah. So anyway, I saw some instances of this where he'd recall people's names out of 20 years ago. I mean, just a guy with a phenomenal pattern recognition for certain events. And sometimes, the phone's going to ring, and then the phone would ring. Now, maybe there's little vibrations that occur, a few, milliseconds before a phone actually rings. He picked up on, I don't know. But he did it a few times enough, and then with people who were around him a lot corroborating some of this to me, I just would say I think he had a certain, gifts that not everybody were tuned into now.
Right. Well, it seems like you enjoyed your time with him. Based on the anecdotes I've heard already,
Sure.
and just talking to you. But I feel like not everybody has the same recollection.
No. Yes, look, it's well documented that Don could be, shall we say, a bit authoritarian, if not heavy-handed, as far as being a band leader, and made sometimes situations very uncomfortable for band members who were trying to just do the job the best they could. And, I know it's pretty well documented. I'm not going to naysay it. But I do want to say this, that even though, I sometimes was on the brunt of this, as were other band members in the band I was in with him, which was the last version of the Magic Band. I think he had mellowed a bit at that point. And I put up with it, as did the other guys. And, because we knew, it was historically very, significant. It was a world historical ensemble. So we were lucky and thrilled to be part of it, honored that he tapped us to be on it. So, you can hear tapes of Buddy Rich going off on this band he picked up in Australia. And so this kind of egregious, tyrannical, outbursts, it's part of the territory, folks, in music and in showbiz and in business and in human relationships. I don't excuse it. And I'm at an age now, I could never put up with it from anybody in my life. I wouldn't put myself in such a situation.
Right. It's kind of like my brother, there's 9 years between he and I, and he always says, a different version of Dad than I do. Because, during his time, they were struggling, trying to get this business off the ground, and it's just more intense, and he mellowed within the 9 years, and I'm guessing Don did the same.
Yeah, I was lucky to see a more mellow Van Vliet than a lot of the original Magic Band members, and a lot of them are still angry about the treatment. They felt abused at his hands. But I don't want to go there, because I'd rather celebrate the positive stuff, and there was so much positive energy. And my memories of one-on-ones, anyway, with Don are really magical. I never met anybody like him. He could be supremely entertaining as a companion and conversationalist, and, a delight to be able to follow his associative leaps and bounds. He was big on wordplay and, in a Joycean sense, in his conversation and also in his lyrics.
Yeah.
He's not really given the credit he should get as being an incredibly great lyricist. And, it's frustrating to me, because I saw and I transcribed for him many great images and poem fragments, and he had notebooks filled with these great observations and also drawings. Great visual artist, great all around, completely sweet, generous to me artist, really standing alone as this kind of visionary in the canon of American arts and letters, and in the world in general. There was nobody really like Beefheart ever, and Don Van Vliet.
Right.
And it's unfortunate that, due to the nature of the business, and also the fact that a lot of it was operating at such a high frequency, only dogs could hear it. No, but only people who were so inclined, who maybe were bored with the status quo. Like I'm pretty bored with most music and art, contemporary music and art that I, perceive. So that it was really for a cognoscenti who got it. People who got it really got it. Mm-hmm. Mostly they'd stick with it and they become rabid fans. For the most people, they didn't get it or they were puzzled by it.
You don't hear many people saying, yeah, Captain Beefheart, he's okay with his magic band.
That's right. No. The only one I ever heard, Philip Glass once in bringing up Beefheart to Philip Glass, he said, I can stand him. I said, so what do you think of Beefheart stuff? But that was funny. But then I think he was offended because Don sometimes would say and do stuff in his interviews that could be very dismissive of contemporary artists and musicians. And, I think he was reacting to some interview, and I'm not even sure Don had ever even heard his stuff. So that was Don's, one of his faux pas there. But generally speaking.
At what point, do you credit Don or your time with Leonard Bernstein, or what point did you decide to branch out in your own playing? When did you change there?
The thing is, I was inspired working with Leonard Bernstein and then with Don, and I really wanted to do music full-time as a living and write it and play it. And I was inhibited to attempt this for a few years, or inhibited myself just out of a sense of shyness, really, if you can believe it. I do have a very shy side, although I've tried to overcome it, and other people don't see this at all and think I'm much too brash and outspoken, but I was then, and that was one factor, and the other factor was probably because I was working within the biggest record company in the world for 13 years as a copywriter. This is at CBS Records. That was my day job, right? I was writing ads for Michael Jackson, The Clash, REO Speedwagon, anything they handed me, I could produce some copy. It was. You
weren't the one who called The Clash the only band that mattered, were you?
Yes, I was.
Yeah?
Yeah, I was.
You came up with that?
I sure did. And I'll tell you something else. At the point that I came up with that line, I actually believed it was true. I was
I always believed it.
I believed it. I was loved that band. Thought they were really saying something profound and revolutionary. And then I only got second thoughts about it once I joined Don and the Magic Band. I thought, well, if there's only one band that matters, let it be our band, I mean, I became like a monomaniac about Beefheart at that point.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Well, tell me about turning in that copy. I mean, were the people at CBS like, yep, that's great, that works?
Yeah, what happened was, again, they knew I was a big fan. Because of my enthusiasm for various musics, I used to generate, a kind of interest. Let's get this guy to work on it because he's a big fan. So I got a hold of the first Clash album. The top execs at CBS in 1977 went to London for the annual CBS Records convention. And their two punk bands were announced to be signed. One was The Clash and the other was the Vibrators. Somebody flipped a coin, and the Clash wound up on Epic, whereas like in the UK, they were on Columbia. And then the Vibrators, who were on Epic in the UK, became a Columbia band. They didn't last very long, the Vibrators, but the Clash did. Yeah. And I got a hold of that first Clash album, and I played it to death, summer of 1977. This is great. These songs like, Janie Jones, and man, it was killing me. Plus, I had seen the Ramones. I was like in on the early punk scene in a big way as something fresh. And I also heard how a lot of it was influenced by Beefheart in a way. And certainly all the avatars of the first wave of punk, this is Johnny Rotten and Joe Strummer, David Byrne, Devo, all of them cited Beefheart as a seminal influence. I didn't think he was getting his due, honestly. But anyway... I worked in, that corporation, and then when I got busy with Don's stuff and a chance to get in that band, I kept the day job because I saw how other artists got chewed up and spit out of the corporate maw. Welcome to the machine. I was like, this music biz is really sucks,
Yeah.
as far as how creative artists get treated. I saw it up close, and I was like, I'm not gonna dip my toe into that. I don't want to leave, unless I do it as a hobby, which is what I did.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they would give me leaves of absence to record with Beefheart, which I took.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So I sort of had the best of both worlds for a while. Up until the point, they just were proud of me. Like, because if I didn't do a good job there, they wouldn't have allowed it. But because I was like their star copywriter in this division called Creative Services, they were actually proud of it. Like, we got this guy. Not only is he writing these great ads for us, but he's off with this avant-garde rock act, Captain Beefheart. And it was something they thought was cool, to have a guy within the corporation. So I was in the corporation as a freelancer, and then became a staff writer. They normalized the situation and hung on to that gig for 13 years.
Wow.
Probably far past my sell-by date, but like I say, I was afraid to go out and just see if I could do it, music full-time. Because I saw what was going on there, and I was like, most of these bands don't have much of a shelf life, right? All this CBGB stuff, how much of it is really going to stick, some of it really stuck, like, David Byrne and Talking Heads. But mainly, most of it was fairly ephemeral, and, so, and I had a wife to support, so I thought I better keep this job. And then I, began this communication with Beefheart, and that was an extension of when I'd met him at Yale. We kept it up, and I was still, I want to play with you, I'd already auditioned for him up in Boston. I went up there, actually, that's another good story, but when I was about to leave for Taiwan after graduation, I had a lost year. My parents said, you got to go over to this. We recommend you work for your dad in Asia. I don't really want to go into the details right now, but
a lost year is sufficient.
That's about it. Okay,
that's
so
perfectly sufficient.
Well, there was, it'll be in my next book. The fact is, I saw in the newspaper in Syracuse Frank Zappa's appearing with special guest Beefheart. I'm like, what? I got to see this, man. Don was ragging on Frank in a big way before this. When I knew him first. Now they're friends again. This is strange. So I met him after the show in Syracuse, hung out with him, took him for barbecued spare ribs at midnight. Then I told him, if you ever need a guitarist, you put the band back together, because he had no band then. I'd like to audition. And he was like, you play the guitar, man? Why didn't you tell me? So, I didn't think I was good enough, and I was a little scared, but I'm ready to try it now. So he said, bring your guitar up to Boston at the end of the week. I'm up there. I brought it up there, played for him after the show, Frank's show. I went back to his hotel, and he said, yeah, great, we're going to do it. And he was vague, though. I said, when? If he had made a firm offer, but there was nothing to offer at this point.
Yeah.
But I had a ticket to go to Taiwan. So when I got back 2 years later, I called him up, and we resumed. And then I moved to New York, got this job. So that's where we are at this point. And I start calling him up. Okay, what about playing with you, man? I want to do that. Well, I already put this band together, but come and see me. I'm going to be in New York. He came twice, played the Bottom Line. I hung out with him both times after the show. And eventually in 80, he said, I'm ready to now use you. I'm going to send you a piece. Learn this. That's how I got in there. Yeah, that's in 80 on an album called Dock at the Radar Station on Virgin.
That's the one with that really nice instrumental what is it? And a cool title, too. A carrot is...
That's a carrot is as close as a rabbit gets to a diamond. That's a keyboard instrumental with the band.
That is?
Yeah, well, it's keyboards, bass, and guitar. No, it's really, it's a keyboard-based maybe there is some guitar in it. I think it's a duet of guitar and keyboard, maybe bass. I have to check it. But I have the instrumental on the B side, or the side 2. Now it's all on CD, so there are no sides. And this one is called Flavor Bud Living. It took me a hell of a long time to learn on the guitar. I learned it off a tape of John French playing it on guitar, who had learned it for an album that had been quashed called Bat Chain Puller. This album never came out officially till many years later. And it was caught up in a lawsuit Frank had going against his first manager, Herbie Cohen. Anyway, so I learned that, and then Don said, no, you got to use my exploding note theory, man. French played it all wrong. So what do you mean? He said, you got to play it like bombs bursting in air. Pa, 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 pa. You know, play each note like it had no relation to the previous note or subsequent note. Okay? I went out to the desert to where he lived in Lancaster with my first wife, Ling, this Chinese woman I'd married. And I got instruction right from from the master as to how to play it. So then I went and recorded it a couple months later on the first or second take in LA. And then toured with the guy all through Europe in November of that year. Came back and did some dates in the U.S. with him through January 81. And that was his last tour. As it turned out, he didn't want to go back on the road. But that turned me on so much to wanting to be a touring musician. That's what really convinced me. And then I'm frustrated because he only wants to do painting. Okay.
You're not just out of college there either. You're
No, I'm now 30. So, and then I finally got my dream. You know, we did one more record called Ice Cream for Crow. He didn't want to tour. I said, well, we got to do a video. He goes, what's that? I said, oh, MTV. Oh, yeah, all right, that stuff. All right, so we did a beautiful video. Then MTV refused to play it, but I got it in the Museum of Modern Art's permanent collection.
Nice.
And I got the last deal happening with Virgin Epic. So I did a lot for this guy. I hooked him up then for his painting career with Julian Schnabel, who was the #1 young abstract expressionist painter based in New York, who had deep connections. And then I resigned. Basically, it just, after 5 years, I felt like I'd taken it as far as I could go. He wasn't happy I was leaving, but I said, look, I've set you up with the biggest art gallery in New York. If you want to make another album, I'm there to play. I got involved for playing, not to be your art pimp, you know. And good luck with it. And then he wasn't happy I was leaving, but I had to really make a break because I felt I'd be effaced. He didn't like it when I was talking about my own music or doing something, but I was dreaming of it at that point. So then I had a couple of years. I stayed at CBS. I wasn't talking to Don. He went off and had some shows. I was watching it from afar. What happened was I got invited to do some sessions for a few artists I liked. A guy named Arthur Russell, my protege.
Yeah.
So you know all about Arthur. Well, at the point I hooked up with Arthur, I met him on co-producing Peter Gordon's Innocence album. I brought in a few artists for CBS, one for CBS Masterworks, that was Peter, and with Peter came Arthur, who I thought was the most creative person that I'd met since Beefheart. And I hooked Arthur up with Rough Trade Records and Blanco y Negro, and was a huge supporter, and, you know, that's another story. And then I played with a few other people. Adrian Sherwood, I did a session for Adrian, and Adrian was great. I did something for Matthew Sweet. And all this led me to believe I should be doing my own music at this point. It's insane. And I got a little encouragement from a few people whose word counted. And then somebody dared me to do my own show. I mean, what happened is a club opened in New York called The Knitting Factory.
Yep.
And I met Michael Dorff, who was the major domo of the Knitting Factory. He came up to my office at CBS and he said, "I'm a punk. I should have my own label." And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm a punk too, working here in this like stupid corporation." But I was a rebel. So he said, "Listen, if you want to do a show, we'd give you a show. Beefheart's guitarist, no problem. That could be cool." So finally I got up my gumption and I put some music together. I worked really hard for some months to assemble a solo show. And in June 1988, June of 88, I did the show on a Tuesday night. I think it was June 11th. Everything that could go wrong, more or less, did in the run-up to the show. They left my name out of the ad in the Village Voice.
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah. I persevered. I put up some flyers. I wasn't going to be defeated. And lo and behold, they had a line snaking out the door around the block. For my very first solo show, I got several encores. I felt like I was in a trance. They handed me $600 off the door. That was good news. And I came back and I said to my lovely wife, who's sitting here next to me, "I'm going to hit music as hard as I can now. I just proved to myself I was an idiot. I can really move a crowd just solo guitar. And I'm going to really try and make up for lost time. I'm going to play my way out of my day job." And I did.
Yeah.
That's how it got going. In the next year, I put Gods and Monsters Mark I together. It was jazz rock with two bassists, all instrumental. I did my first film score for The Golem with my childhood composer friend, Walter Horn. I had a history improvising music with Walter. He's a great player and composer. And, started making demos and recording stuff. I put my first album out in 90. I did as much as I could, and I continue to do as much as I could. And now I have 30-plus albums out and 12 live film scores and played on about 60, 70 of other people's albums and written about 350 registered compositions, some of which are very well-known songs like Grace and Mojo Pin for Jeff Buckley. And, I had some success with it. So.
I know a little bit about that collaboration, how that came about with the Tim Buckley tribute.
Right.
And then how did it come to pass that you guys composed those few numbers together, but then was it just kind of a music industry thing where they were like, "Well, no, he's a solo artist"?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's sort of what happened. Although I'd say Jeff had a little complicity in the rendering of rending of the relationship after about a year for those reasons. But anyway, what happened was Hal Wilner, my friend, who did these multi-artist tributes, put together a tribute to Tim Buckley, and I was asked to participate. He said, "Well, Jeff Buckley has come forward." I said, "I didn't know he had a son named Jeff." "Well, neither did I or anybody, but he has, and I think you'd be a good person for him to work with." Jeff, I think, might have asked to work with me, really, if he saw the roster, because he was a big Beefheart fan. Mm-hmm. Jeff and I had a great year, and we knew we could write together from the first day we started making music together. And basically what happened was when I left CBS, I had a deal with Columbia Records with a female vocalist who was in Gods and Monsters. And I won't mention her here, but it wasn't going very well after a couple of years under contract. And I'd left my day job. I was kind of way out on a limb. But I had a lot of faith that, it would work. And what happened was the guy who signed us, me and this female vocalist, left the company to go to Polydor or Polygram at that point. So I was thrown to the wolves, and it coincided with my first solo album, Skeleton at the Feast, on Enemy Records to come out. That was getting 4- and 5-star reviews in places like Q magazine, and pretty much anything I put out always would get stellar reviews, but there seems to not be a correlation between that and sales. Would that there were.
Well, it never is, really,
yeah,
is
probably
it?
not. But anyway, it kept me going. It kept me running. So at that point, though, when I came back from a tour and told them this and was all gung-ho, they just said, we've dropped your project. They put the junior A&R guy on the phone to inform me that there was no deal. I was like, how can you do that? We have a contract. And they said, this guy said to me, one of the coldest expressions I ever heard in the music biz, you can't afford to sue us. So,
damn.
Yeah, I always tell that to classes as some cautionary, just watch out, folks. You know,
right.
It's not all a garden of
how do you respond to something like
I
that?
don't know what to say. And then the guy said very quickly, maybe we can have lunch. I got to go. My response to it was, to try and allay my wife's gasps of terror.
Right.
Like, we don't have health insurance. What are we going to do? You left your day job. I said, I'm going to keep going in music because I know I'm good. And I have Jeff Buckley waiting in the wings, and he's expressed an interest in working with me. And I rang him up shortly thereafter, and he said, I'll be your singer. So that was a comforting thought, So I went to bed feeling a little bit of security, like I'm going to refashion Gods and Monsters. That was the name of my band, begun in 1989, with Jeff as the lead singer, because he's one of the best musicians I ever met. So then I had to get busy. Now I have to write some music for us. So the very next day, I just sat with my guitar, and over a few days emerged the music that became Grace and Mojo Pin, which later became the first two songs on Jeff's 2 million selling Grace album.
Right.
They were guitar instrumentals. One of them had already begun, and then the other one just sort of occurred to me. You know how I compose? I just turn my mind off, pass my fingers over the strings of my guitar, which happened to be in a drop D tuning because of the last thing I'd played in Europe before I'd come back to America on that tour. When I got this bad news was actually, folks, Evening Bell, which is a Beefheart tour de force solo piece on Ice Cream for a Crow, which took me 6 weeks to learn. That's in drop D. So I had that tuning already up on the guitar, so that's ironic that 3 of my best-known pieces are in this drop D.
Wow, that is weird.
Tuning. Well, maybe it's nice, too. Maybe it's the synchronistic thing. I definitely, always love writing in that key. So...
yeah.
So that's how I would work. I would write finished instrumentals with all the motifs and riffs and harmonic structure, send them to Jeff on cassette. He'd come back with perfect melodies and lyrics to fit them like a glove. He rarely modified anything beyond, please double this section. I have some more words here. I feel a verse.
Okay.
And that was his fantastic gift, and working with him was a gift. He was the best collaborator I've ever had. I miss him dearly, and he was a fantastic guy. Also, for the most part, we did have our ego issues and, eventually a rupture with the relationship, but he resumed it when he realized, those were good songs. And he wasn't very prolific at that point, and the label was saying, well, what do you got besides covers? We signed a guy doing, wall-to-wall covers pretty much at Chennai, where he was playing. So then I got a call from him a couple years later. Hey, remember those great songs? I'd like to record them on this record I'm going to record for Sony. And I was like, sure. Great.
Well, that's great. So it was kind of like the creative relationship, then a falling out, and then you resumed it. That's great.
Yeah, and like when he died, he had asked me for more music for a follow-up album, which he was having difficulty writing, and the label seemed to be rejecting everything he'd turned in. So I was really sad and really overwhelmed to hear of his tragic passing, and not just because I'd lost a great friend, and wonderful person, but as a collaborator, I just thought, think of all those great songs we could have written together still.
Yeah.
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 So then, but then, you kept going and
I kept going,
here we are.
man. And here I just keep putting one foot in front of the other and marching along to wherever, I have some more albums for sure in me. I mean, many. I love making music. It's my life. I tour as much as possible. I played in 40 countries. Just came back from Paris. I sold out the French Cinémathèque Française with a live film score for a Lon Chaney film, The Unholy Three, and sold out at the Sunset Jazz Club with a solo concert. I played in Amsterdam, a tribute to Jeff with a great Dutch vocalist, Jolene Grunberg, I'd met a few years ago on a tribute to Jeff. And I do as much as I can, as frequently as possible. Everywhere, it's my life, it's my living. It's harder than ever, though, I'll tell you, not the playing of it or the composing of new music, but the whole landscape of the music business changed, especially with recording and getting paid on your copyrights. And also everybody wants to play live. And there are not so many situations, even in Europe anymore, where it used to be easier for non-mainstream musicians, particularly jazz musicians, to find employment. A lot of those gigs were government-sponsored gigs. And a lot of the right-wing governments that have come in to power in Europe, one of the first things that they slash in their budgets is subsidies to the arts, particularly subsidizing bringing in foreign musicians. It's always, let's build up the local music scene. So, I'm not complaining. I mean, I'm doing all right. I'm doing, better than most people who attempt to do this for a living. I've managed by hook or by crook to sustain myself since 1990 when I left my day job doing this. I'm 28 years out doing this full time. My only regret is I hadn't really applied myself earlier. But like I said, I didn't have I had a lot of fear about that and anxiety.
Right.
It was only when I hit a certain age and somebody said, oh, there's this club, you could play a show here, did I get ambitious to take that step into doing my own thing in music. Before that...
I mean, it's an interesting thing, like heeding the call. It's probably the trickiest industry to heed the call in, because, great talent could be washed away and overlooked.
Well,
given the wrong place and the wrong time.
This is true. A lot of it just depends on the hands that are dealt you. Situations often are out of one's control, and sometimes paradoxically, the more you push to try and get gigs, the further they seem to recede off in the distance. And then there's all sorts of advice. Oh, well, you don't have a manager. The manager should be... You try and find a competent manager in the music biz who actually has connections to do anything, and you'll find a guy who wants to make sure he's going to make X amount of money every year from the amount of time invested, or he might invest, or one of his associates might invest in your career. Not easy. Not easy.
So you have done this all without a manager?
I've had managers come in there on and off, and but pretty much yes. The answer is yes. I've had to be on the front line of my career because nobody else would know it as well as I, what needed to be done, number one, and what it consisted of. And part of the reason I've had longevity in my career is because I'm very diversified in the projects that I do. Maybe to the point I've confused a lot of people now. Most people who are sort of have a big name in music do one thing specifically, and various iterations of that thing over the years. If once they make that thing pay, they specialize and they don't confuse. Because I don't know, I like a lot of different musics. I don't know if you give this any credence, but I am a double Gemini as far as my astrological sign, meaning there's a lot of different voices and personalities within me as a person, as an artist. I like a lot of, to me it was natural to play 30s Chinese pop and segue from that into Wagner or whatever else I was going to do next. Write original songs, put together a tribute to Beefheart or whatever. So because I was so diversified, it may have enabled me to work more, because if one thing was going to slow down, then I'd sort of segue into the other thing or the next thing. But it may have confused the general public. It blurred my identity. Like, what kind of artist is this? What are we dealing with here? We heard he was avant-garde. I'll accept I'm coming out of the downtown music scene, whatever they called it here. And yet, I'm probably the only downtown alumni who wrote hit songs for Jeff Buckley or, some big artists. So I like pop music. I got a foot in pop music. I'm not going to deny it. That was my roots growing up.
When you're thinking about the overview of your career, what do you think is the song that will be your legacy?
I'd say Grace. And I used to make a joke in a mordant kind of way in the old days. They stickered my first album, Enemy Records did, ex-Captain Beefheart. The very first album, Skeleton at the Feast, which was all instrumental and live and has really some fierce devotees. I think it's one of my best records, mainly recorded in Holland on my early solo tours. So they stickered it that said ex-Captain Beefheart. Now, I was taken to task by somebody in the Wire magazine. Like, he's using Beefheart's name. And it was like, really? That's absurd. I'm not to tell people that I played with this guy. It wasn't my idea, but I'll just say, if that's a way to get people to pay attention to this record who they might not know me, why would that be a bad thing? And how is that using of Beefheart? Because it's true. Yeah, I'm an ex-Captain Beefheart alumni, But then the joke became, all right, when I die, my tombstone will say ex-Captain Beefheart. I used to always. Then a few years later, I'd say, and then maybe it'll say also, and Jeff Buckley.
And may that tombstone not have to be engraved for a long, long time. Gary Lucas is currently on tour in the UK, and his latest album is The World of Captain Beefheart with Nona Hendrix. Special thanks go to Gabriel Reifer Cohen and Andrew Walls for their assistance on this episode. Additionally, I would like to extend a very, very special thanks and congratulations to Chandler Martin, Juan Camilo Sarasa, and Nora Terrell. These are 3 students of Berklee College of Music who are also work studies for Berklee Online. And this month they are graduating. Congratulations. Without your help, this podcast wouldn't be what it is today. Thank you so much, Chandler, Juan, and Nora. And thank you very much for listening. The new serialized crowdfunding podcast from Berklee Online is coming this summer, so stay tuned and visit us at online.berklee.edu/take note to sign up for our digest. I will talk to you soon.